This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 362. Who wins from high house prices, other than banks?
If you look at the millennial generation, just 31% can own their own homes in the UK. In France, that figure is 41%. Now, partly this is a function of supply. When Labour left office, of course, they famously remarked that there was no money left. They'd also totally failed to build new homes at the rate that was necessary.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, remember that man a year ago talking about how after 13 years in power you can still blame the previous government for not building enough houses. But that is a big part of the problem with housing in the UK, isn't it? And in Australia and many parts of the world where prices are going up and unaffordability is only getting worse. There's just not enough new houses being built. So we know who loses when house prices go up. But who are the winners? And other than building more houses, what can we do to make housing more affordable? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, despite the cost of living crisis in the UK, we've seen the average UK house price. And it is an average, so it's a bit meaningless because, I mean, there's a huge variation, obviously, across the UK. But the average UK house price has increased by 3.5% in the 12 months to April 2023. So here we are. Interest rates are through the roof. People, prices are through the roof as well. We're getting taxed more than ever before. There's a real cost of living squeeze, but we're still finding money to increase house prices by 3.5% in the 12 months to April 2023. Actually, in October, prices are even higher. They've come back a bit. They're 1.7% higher than they are now, but still 3.5% year on year. How is that happening?
I think the stimulus that we had due to COVID is a part of the reason why, because the deficit the government ran massively increased the amount of money in people's bank accounts. You couldn't spend a lot of that money on many consumer items which had just gone by the wayside in the meantime, travel being an obvious one, of course. And people with extra cash had more for a deposit, and that was a major barrier for buying into housing, and suddenly they were over that barrier and they decided to go and use that extra money as a deposit. So
new buyers coming into the market.
New buyers or buyers, the new buyers, people who didn't have the money power beforehand. Yeah. The government stimulus gave them the additional to get over the deposit hurdle, and bang, they're into the market.
So in our street there, everyone's done their house up during the lockdown. So that money, they had their house, they've got their mortgage, but the garden centres were open, just about the only thing that was open during lockdown. And so were DIY stores. So we all spent the spare cash that we had because we couldn't buy anything else on buying plants for the garden and all the DIY stuff. So I'm not sure, it's not going to account for all of it, but it'd be a contributing factor, wouldn't it? The housing stock perhaps has got better because we spent money doing our houses up during the last couple of years.
Oh, well, it wouldn't be hard to improve most English houses.
Thank you.
Pardon me, but
I invite him around to our house and all he does is complain about English houses.
It's because I spend so much time in Europe as well as here, and you see the quality of the housing stock. It's just ridiculous how much better most of the housing stock is in Europe than it is in the UK. Doors that shut. Doors that keep the outside air out when you want it out. Windows that are double glazed. Yeah. I mean,
we do have a problem with drawers closing in our kitchen, I have to say. But we're going to fix that because we're going to redo the kitchen when we can afford it. So there we are. More housing improvement. And obviously we are all aspirational towards European standards because that's what people want in Britain. We just want to be Europeans. Obviously, it's but I mean that would be an element of it. But your point is no, most of it is actually just being pushed up. Prices are being pushed up because
I mean prices of house prices have become the topic of conversation in most developed countries because they've got out of reach.
They have been for years, haven't they? It's been a topic of conversation for as long as I've lived, I think.
Unfortunately, if you go back to it began with the deregulation of the housing market, which really began in the 70s. It became on steroids in the 80s in the UK. But what that enabled was for banks to get in, like in the UK case for quite some. Really until 1982, if you wanted to borrow money to buy a house, you had to borrow off a building society. And what a building society was is the classic loanable funds where some people have put their money into the bank, into the building society ahead of you. That money goes into a bank account. You then want to borrow. You can take the money out of that building society bank account to do your buying, but anybody who's put their money in knows that it's not a demand deposit. You can't demand it back straight away.
Because it's being invested in property for somebody else.
Yeah, and once it's in there, you can't get it out easily. Okay, that's the whole idea of a building society. And you have to invest and be there for some time before they'll consider
so
you
they're
for a
not
loan.
creating money in the
They're
way
not creating money.
Yeah.
Now, suddenly we deregulate and banks are creating money, and bang, that gives you a cause to drive the house prices up. And the link is quite straightforward. If you would think about if you're buying a house, then most of your purchase power comes from borrowed money. Okay, if that borrowed money is creating new money, it's creating additional demand. And that demand is what sets the house price. And then what sets the change in the house price is the change in that demand. So what drives house prices is the change in new mortgages, new mortgage debt. Compared to GDP. And that's when you do the empirical work, and I work in a paper with Paul Omerond and I forgot my co-author who did the empirical work. We did the causation, what causes the change. Do house price changes cause mortgages, or do mortgage changes cause house price changes? And overwhelmingly the causation was the opposite direction. Mortgage change caused house price change. So we have...
And that is, you don't need to think too hard about that, particularly in places like Australia where you go to a house price auction and...
The house price auction, rather. They're actually auctioning the house price rather
than
exactly
the house.
That's pretty much it.
It has got very little to do with it.
You're buying a house price. This house price will rise.
And you go to
You might be able to sleep in the rooms as well. I mean, we haven't checked the bedrooms yet, but there may be bedrooms inside that house.
And the sale goes like this. You go to the bank because, of course, you've got to turn up with a 10% deposit as a cheque.
Or a 5%, or a 2.5%.
Whatever it might be.
Yeah, but or 35 years, or 55 years.
When I bought stuff at auctions, it was always 10%. So you go to your bank the week before and say, okay, I've got a couple of auctions that I want to go to.
Yep.
How much can I borrow? And they'll say, well, you can borrow this much. Okay, here's a check for 10% of it. And they give you the check. You go along, you look at that check and go, okay, well, I can bid up to 10 times the amount because that's all I've got the deposit for. And I'm going to go all the way to the edge of that, which is entirely what will the bank lend you rather than what is the house worth? Because you're there looking at everybody else who wants the house as well. And it's the whole fear of missing out. I want to get this house. It becomes an emotional thing. And because you've got perhaps got the attachment to the house, or you're just desperate to buy a house because you've been to so many bloody auctions and you're sick of it. And you've gone through all the bother about getting the house inspected. In Australia, you've got to do all the searches and all that sort of stuff before you have the auction. It's a crazy way it operates there. So it is entirely being driven by that conversation with your bank manager about how much you can have.
Yeah, and that's what drives house prices. So letting banks lend to housing has been the cause of the house price bubble. And now we've reached a saturation level of private debt before COVID hit. And that what it meant was people had to, the deposit became out of reach.
Yeah.
Okay? It wasn't just a case that the interest rate was, the interest rate had fallen dramatically.
Right. So then the government comes along and says, we're going to pay you now to stay at home. You don't need to pay your train fare to get into work. And there's nothing else you can buy.
You got the deposit. And that triggered the next level of lending.
Right. But why would we do this? So the UK, and because house prices have increased, but they're not increased enormously compared to other things you can invest in. So house prices in the UK, and this is obviously mirrored in most developed countries, house prices have gone from 150,000 in early 2005. Can you imagine buying a house for 150,000 now? It's to peak over 290,000 last October. So they're close to doubling in the UK in 18 years. But that is 20% higher than it should be if you based it on inflation. So you could say, well, okay, if I bought then and sold, that's a 20% return I've got. But if you look at the FTSE 100 from the same period, it's gone from 2,800 to 7,200. So that's 2.5 times higher. That is a much better investment than housing. They are both assets. Why the huge variation, and why would you choose the house rather than investing in shares? And invariably, shares are a better return than houses.
Well, partially, it's the fact that to actually invest in shares in the first place, you've got to be wealthy. Okay, like most people these days through this pension funds have got some exposure to the stock market, but it's not a conscious exposure. It's a money pooling effect. If you're going to have your own broker, then you're in the top maybe 5% of the population.
Less than one, I would have thought. But anyway, whatever the percentage
day traders and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
But a tiny fraction of the population gets in there. And then what, as well as like the same effect that I talked about for mortgages applies to shares, it's margin debt. I only can get margin debt data for America. But if you look at the level of margin debt, what people buy shares with is partially borrowed money. So I think there's more cash, actual money involved in buying shares than there is in buying houses. Like if you said a 10% deposit beforehand, so 90% of the purchase price is borrowed. In the case of shares with the margin debt, that used to be possible. If you go back to the 1920s, if you put down a 10% deposit on shares, you could buy the other 90% with borrowed money on margin. Now it's a 50-50 rule. But the same logic still applies. A large part of your purchasing power comes from borrowed money using margin debt. And then when you take, what do you get is a relationship between the level of new margin debt and the share prices. So change in new margin debt and change in share prices. The same basic logic applies.
So it is just the ratio of how much you've got to have to be able to borrow.
But the other thing which has been thrown in share prices, and this is important, is QE. Because quantitative easing it was done with the belief, and you can find Ben Bernanke on this, I think in the 2009 papers in 2009, 2010, saying that the central bank was doing QE to stimulate purchases of assets, okay? Because they thought that would then the wealth effect out of having more assets would cause more consumption. Now, talk about roundabout stupid logic and not understanding the damn mechanics anyway, but that was a major part of why QE was done. Now, QE was also...
Because there'd be people buying shares. Their shares would be worth so much more, they're then going to sell those shares to spend the money, rather than sell those shares to buy other shares.
It was a complete failure in terms of its impact upon consumption because, funnily enough, before Bernanke came out with that paper, Federal Reserve economists had done work and said, does the wealth effect actually exist? And they found it doesn't exist for shares.
Don't have to do a great deal of research there, do you? Just look at a decade and go, well, okay, we had QE being introduced in various parts of the world, share prices going up, consumption not going up.
Yeah. But what drives the share prices up is when you QE occurred, you're buying bonds of current holders of bonds, and therefore their bond holdings go down, but the holdings of cash go up. Okay. Now you're talking about the private banks who were some of the recipients of QE can't actually spend that money. The belief that the mainstream economists had was they'd lend out their reserves, which is garbage.
Yeah.
That is just bad accounting. But on the other side, when you bought bonds off non-bank financial institutions, which were allowed to buy shares, their holding of bonds goes down, their holding of cash goes up. Cash doesn't earn a return. They use their cash to buy shares instead. So QE definitely inflated the share market, and then there's a bit of a wash over from that as well into share market speculators turning that profit into
saying
housing.
Without QE, that differential between housing and investment in shares wouldn't
be as
be
extreme. Yeah.
But it's still an opportunity, isn't it? And if you've got extra cash, I wonder how much new housing, new borrowing we actually have seen over the last few years. Because I know lots of people are still struggling, even with the ability to have met the deposit, of actually being able to afford to buy, and how much of it house prices are actually going up from existing established or people investing in property, because there's a bit of that going on as well. But I mean, if you take it, for example, people investing, buying an investment property, you'd be questioning why would they do that versus buying more shares if they feel as though they could get a better return on shares. We're still going back to the property. And I guess if there's too much money anyway, it's inflating both assets. And how do you stop that happening? And I've heard people arguing, well, this is an argument for crypto. It's just another asset class you can buy into. It's another Ponzi scheme that can be inflated. And if that goes up in value, then perhaps houses won't go up quite as much and shares won't go up quite as much because people aren't ploughing money into those asset classes, which becomes a worrying case for the finance industry can just keep on investing asset classes for you to invest in to stop this investment over here inflating and this investment over here inflating. We'll just create more asset classes.
And throughout the whole thing, you're not getting any more productive capacity
out of any of it.
You're not producing, more things to counter climate change and so on. So it's. I mean, I keep on coming back to one of the most popular posts I ever wrote, which is called "The Roving Cavaliers of Credit," and that's a direct quote from Marx. Karl Marx, Volume 3 of Capital, I think, talking about...
Didn't think you were talking Groucho Marx.
Well, I think I actually call myself a Groucho Marxist, so Marx with a sense of humour. And irony, but when you look at, he said, the power of the finance sector. He said these occasionally the dynamics of the system enable these. He called them usurers. Okay, and the stock market speculators and usurists around them to interfere with real production, and the gang knows nothing about it and should have nothing to do with it. And talk about living through Marx's curse 1.5 centuries later. You have a bunch of morons who should have no role whatsoever in deciding investment who dominate it because we've let the finance sector take over everything.
That's scary, isn't it? We're talking about 1.5 centuries, actually, and how much have we moved on, really, in that time? Look, banks are given a hard time right now because they are supposedly making a mozza out of high interest rates, and they're not passing it on in terms of giving out loans. So in answer, because really today the question is, we've got high house prices. Who are the winners out of all of this? So are the banks the winners? Are the property developers the winners? We'll look at all of that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Back after this.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, banks supposedly do a serviceability check of loans that they make to make sure that people who are taking out loans can afford to pay them back. The problem is, of course, they didn't foresee interest rates getting quite so high. So UK lenders, they tend to add a margin of 2.5% to the loans rate when you take out the loan. So if the interest rate was 2.5%, then can you still afford it if the interest rate was at 5%? The problem is, a 2-year fixed mortgage right now is 6.5%, and a lot of people getting out loans at 1.5%. So that is a real issue. That shows you where we are right now. Have banks created a rod for their own back? They don't seem to be struggling too much. They seem to be reporting mega profits, even though you'd imagine they'd have a huge amount of toxic loans on their books.
Yeah, well, I think the issue here is how many loans are variable versus fixed rate.
Yeah.
Because in Australia's case, I think Australia's probably the canary in the coal mine here, that most rates are variable, like 80% or more of mortgages.
Yeah, here it's the opposite.
It's the other. So you don't get any impact here until people are forced to refinance. Yeah. And so it's the refinancing shock, which is the issue.
And we're going through that bit by bit. So 2 and 5 year fixed loans is what tends to happen here. No more than 5 years. So, we're working our way through that right now.
Whereas the Australian, with 80% of the mortgages are being variable rate, if the central bank puts up the rate by 0.25%,
everyone feels it straight away.
The very next day, your rate goes up by 0.25% as well. So consumption should be being squeezed quite radically in Australia right now. And it'd be intriguing to see what happens in Australian house prices versus English or American, where you've got that delayed effect, and it's only if the rate still applies when you are forced to refinance that you actually wear the impact of that higher rate. And in the meantime, the point that Warren Mosley makes quite a bit of, anybody who's buying bonds right now is getting a very high return on the bonds. So that's a positive boost for income at the upper echelons of the economy. Yeah. But it's not the...
because bond prices, because the yields are so high, because interest rates are so high, bond prices have come down so much.
Yeah, now that's damaging the value of the assets. If you have bonds which are a fixed coupon rate bond, then you've lost capital value. But the new bonds you're buying, and the American government is still running a deficit of the order of 8% of GDP.
Yes, there's a lot of cheap bonds out there.
A lot of cheap bonds turning up. Well, bonds which give you a higher yield.
Yeah.
And that again means that there's a dramatic cash flow for those who are buying the bonds. The wealthy end of the market, not the poor end.
So the regulator is investigating banks in the UK for not passing on interest rate rises to savers. So the retail net income. So I wondered whether this is actually how it works. In effect, they are two different things, aren't they? Because a bank will pay an interest rate out to somebody who's saving. But that's a bit out of fashion these days, isn't it? The idea of saving.
I haven't seen interest payment into my account for something like 20 years.
Yeah. So I wonder. Well, whereas obviously, if you borrow money, they create it. So the idea of the banks are getting funded by the difference between how much they're paying in interest to savers versus how much they're charging people is a misnomer, isn't it? And yet here
it's a myth. Yeah.
And yet here we have the FCA, the bank regulator, saying that they're investigating banks because of that differential, and saying that they are making higher income by not meeting that differential, by not passing on the higher interest rate to people who are saving. I mean, it's bizarre that people are talking like this, because of course the press is all onto this as well, saying yes, if they've got to behave. Actually, if they did pass on money to saving, I mean, that's probably not what we actually don't want people to save, do we? I mean, if you're trying to regulate the whole thing and say, well, what's best for the economy, don't save, surely. Spend.
Well, I mean, save. This is another area where terms which make sense for the individual are nonsense for the collective.
Yeah, what is saving anyway? Absolutely.
Yeah.
What is the definition of it?
Yeah. So if you want to increase aggregate savings, you have to have the government running a deficit.
Yeah.
Or you have to have the private. If you look in terms of, if you define savings as growth in M2, then it also comes out of the government's people borrowing more money from banks.
And if I pay off my mortgage that little bit faster, have I in effect
that's
saved?
Negative. That's negative savings. You're reducing the amount of money in private bank accounts. Savings is a word I would actually, if I could manage to do it, I'd ban it from macroeconomics. It's irrelevant because the individuals can't save money into existence. But if you're trying to measure the change in the aggregate amount of money and see that as being based on savings, you're completely misunderstanding the macroeconomy. And yet we have people in government and policy positions in government who do precisely that because they've taught a theory of economics which ignores the role of money. And so what they're going to say on money can be as stupid as what any other uneducated person can say on the same topic, but they've got a PhD in economics to back their uneducated statements.
So you believe them? Yeah. So whereas I don't, so don't believe anything I say. So banks are doing well because they are just charging higher interest rates on the loans they are giving out for the money that they've created. So you are, I mean, pure and simple, the mortgage is costing you more now.
Yeah.
It's going to take you longer to pay back, or you're having to.
I mean, benefit for the bank. The danger is the banks, the value of the bank's bond portfolios.
Yeah.
But most banks on-sell those the bonds they purchase on the primary treasury market. They on-sell those to non-bank financial institutions. So Silicon Valley Bank was an exception on that front. So most of the private lending banks are not going to be suffering from the lower value of bonds, courtesy of a higher interest rate, but they are going to be making more on their loans. And that's quite a substantial amount more. Mortgage rates have gone from 2% to 7%?
Well, I thought the opposite was how I thought they were hanging on. Well, before we got into the situation we're in now, they were shifting their cash reserves for bonds because at least they're getting interest payment on it. But you're saying now, well, they will have got out of that game and they will have switched back to cash. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, what's saying with private banks, when the way that the Treasury auctions go is that when the government is not allowed to sell bonds directly to the central bank.
Yeah.
Okay? So if there's a deficit, let's say the deficit is, they use the UK type figures that say, £300 billion, then the government issues £300 billion worth of bonds. The bonds are purchased on the primary market, which is made by banks and other institutions
spending out of their reserves
that have accounts at the Bank of England.
Yeah.
They then can trade those on the open market and sell those to non-bank financial institutions, the Morgan Stanleys of the world, the pension funds, and so on, which don't have accounts at the central bank, which are financial institutions. So most of the value of the bonds has turned up being owned by pension funds,
right,
insurance companies, and things like that.
And for the commercial banks, it's gone. Their reserves have gone back into cash. In effect.
Yeah, they've gone back into cash. But they. I think
so. They're not losing out on bonds. So I mean, they will also. Maybe they've still got some bonds, but they have them of different length
They're not
maturities.
vulnerable in the same way that Silicon Valley Bank was, because they had a lot of long-term, long-dated government bonds.
Yeah.
Therefore suffered very badly. But it's so in terms of the banks themselves, they are now allowed to charge a much larger rate of interest.
Yeah, pure and simple.
Yeah.
Without any necessary increase in costs associated with it. Yeah. So no wonder they're doing well. So should they be charged for that? Should we have a tax? Is it another opportunity to say, well, there should be a windfall, because they've not done anything to create this situation. It's just happened to them, like oil companies. Suddenly, we put a windfall tax on them because oil prices went up, not from any action of their own. They were just lucky.
Anything to reduce the power of the financial sector, but it ain't going to happen. I mean, it's the frustrating element of seeing what the causal factors are behind things like house price bubbles, knowing that the way of preventing it and knowing that way is never going to be used. So the banks will continue profiting out of this, and Marx's comment about the roving cavaliers of credit stands strong 1.5 centuries after he made it.
Well, it seems like, yes, they win whatever happens, doesn't it? Through good times or bad times. And then there's the builders. They seem to be doing okay as well. They argue that they're not, but if we take Persimmon, which is one of the big builders in the UK, it's got revenue of about £3.8 billion, doing all right. That's 2022 number. Its profit before tax was 730 million. So that's a 19% margin.
That's a pretty high margin.
For building something, isn't it? So, and that has to be because there's something that they're creating which is in demand and people are prepared to pay for it.
Well, again, unfortunately, we've been dragged into a world where we speculate on property rather than deciding to invest and try to innovate to a point of new technology, which means we can beat other competitors. And this is just the sign of the extent to which speculation rather than investment dominates how economies behave. And the thing is, you don't make more money by having a more expensive house. You can't sell the kids for a higher price because they come out of a higher priced house. So what we've got is a focus on speculation rather than investment. And to channel Keynes once more, when the development of an economy is based on the activities, is a side effect of the activities of a casino, the process is likely to be all done. And I think we've got ourselves caught in a world dominated by speculation rather than investment.
I guess, even though it sort of hurts to think that here's a building company that's making, getting close towards a 20% margin, you'd be thinking, well, how is that fair? In a way, maybe it's better for the economy that they are doing that, because there is a ceiling on how much you can borrow based on how much you earn, so how much the bank can lend to you. And if all the rest of it is basically going to the bank in terms of, how much they're charging you for the margin, at least this is a slug of that money, which is creating money for somebody. At least Persimmon is employing people, and that profit will be used to pay dividends to shareholders, some of which might be normal people. But it'll be, there's money being pushed back into the economy, at least through the fact that they are taking a little bit out of all of this.
I'm happy to some extent that it's actually a manufacturing firm that's getting some money out of this whole process.
But 20% still.
But it's still, you're a spin-off to the financial sector. The casino dominates capitalism.
And why this particular part in the chain as well? Why wouldn't land value be pushed up so high if the end result is that we are paying so much for house
that's what
prices?
Is happening. Land value, the price of land is, the fact that there's a house on there is just an ancillary effect.
Yeah.
I mean, you need a house there to be able to justify the valuations.
When the developer buys up agricultural land, it's a many multiples of the price they paid for the land to actually based on how much they're selling that property for at the end of the day. So you would have thought landowners would be, screwing them for more money than they are. So
we've got a landlord financialized economy which is not investing and not developing its own productive capabilities over time.
So how do we get out of this situation then in countries like the UK where other than obviously controls on banks, and we've talked about that in the past, but can we also make it harder for the banks to make more money by just bringing house prices down, so it's less of a speculation? So this preoccupation, for example, with everything being in the southeast of England, if we could lower the cost of housing, like, for example, new development areas, so doing stuff like, New Milton Keynes, towns that are developed, the idea is that they are a cheaper part of the country, to try and attract people, attract new schools, new businesses, setting up entire new communities, almost like a start again approach, where people will gravitate to properties cheap, education's good, jobs are plentiful, house prices are lower. I guess it wouldn't take long before house prices go up. That's the problem.
Again, it's focusing on the supply side rather than the demand side of housing and shares as well. And what drives those is the demand side, not the supply side. I'd rather find a way of reducing the flow of new mortgage debt. And that you do that, you've got to reduce house prices as well, because if you want to reduce the level of mortgage debt, you've got to reduce the level of house prices too. And that's why I argue in favour of what I call a modern debt jubilee, where you use the government's money, cash, and capability to require people to pay their mortgages down. You reduce the value of houses, but you reduce the value of debt that people have against those houses as well. We've just got to, like, the financial sector is probably 3 times the size that it actually needs to be. And what by avoiding focusing upon the demand side and looking at who creates the demand, and then creates the prices as well out of that, we're locked into a world where the financial markets dominate everything.
But there is a supply component to it as well, isn't there? I mean, the fact that
people, even if you think it's typical neoclassical supply and demand curve type arguments, everybody agrees that it takes a long time to change the supply. You've virtually got a vertical supply curve, and people are trying to move that vertical supply curve rather than saying, well, actually what causes the house price is the level of demand. Where does the demand come from? A large part of it is levered financial demand. If we can reduce that, we can reduce the house prices.
Well, maybe it's a bit of both, because I mean, on the supply side, we are very focused in one part of the country, aren't we? So the median house price in Hull now.
Yeah.
Who wants to live in Hull? I know. Good point. Thanks for asking it. £156,000.
Yeah.
The median house price in Guildford, just down the road from here, is £571,000. So if you can't afford a house in Guildford, move to Hull.
How far is Hull from Guildford? Pardon me being ignorant.
Oh, so Hull is way up in the north of England.
There
so
you
it's
go.
sort of like, just Leeds, Yorkshire. It's East Yorkshire, basically, on the banks of the glistening Humber. And it's the oil that's glistening, the oil slicks. But yeah, I mean, it's a million miles away from Guildford, whereas Guildford is Surrey, it's stockbroker belt. So yeah, it's a world of difference. But the price difference is huge. There's no jobs in Hull, of course. So, but if there was an issue that could solve that problem, the constraints of geography is doing its bit to constrain supply. And so that supply component, I hear what you're saying, that you've got to solve demand, but you've got to solve supply as well, haven't you? And it is the geographic focus in the UK which is creating that constraint. And that's why house prices, I only mention those two numbers because they are poles apart, and yet we are in the same country. And you can get between these two places in about two and a half hours on the train.
You no longer have a diversified industrial structure. England made the deliberate decision under Maggie Thatcher to focus upon services rather than manufacturing. Manufacturing can be and was dispersed at the time. Manchester was one of the major industrial centres. When you get rid of the manufacturing and you've got left as services, it all focuses upon the City of London, the square mile, and therefore you get this incredible disparity between prices where the stockbroker belt lives and prices where what once were factory workers live. If you want to reverse that disparity, you've got to bring back the industry. You can't do it with the current dominance of over everything in the UK, the finance sector.
Right. And that would be a big contributing factor to the rise in house prices, because there's a shortage of, again, take your point on the demand.
Yeah.
But it's that shortage of supply because there's only a certain amount of properties available in the southeast, which is where all the work is.
Oh, well, work is a fairly generous term there. That's all the gambling is.
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to be a gambler, you've got to be close to the casino, and the casino is the square mile, and therefore prices in the square mile and within the vicinity of the square mile go through the roof. But what used to be the prices in the industrial regions where there are no more jobs, they collapse.
Yeah. So we need an industrial policy as well as constraining
which
banks.
Is the last thing the UK is going to develop.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm a cynic.
It will. A plan would any sort of plan at all would be a good start, wouldn't it? Even if it's the wrong plan, we'll take it. At least there's a discussion point. Look, next time we're going to talk about QE and QE versus the people's QE. And would a QE, which one works best? We know the answer to that, but would a people's QE actually work? Would this be the time to do it? It'd be inflationary to do that sort of thing now, wouldn't it? But we'll look at that on the podcast next week. Good to talk, Steve.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.